Hey there, students. Here we are in chapter 5. We're going to be looking at social power and conflict theory of crime. This is a reading by Robert Quinney, and Robert Quinney was working off of our other theorist, Howard Becker. If you remember, Becker looked at relativism and labeling theory in crime. And so Quinney's theory is very similar, and you'll find that a lot of these theories just build off of each other. What sets Quinney's theory apart from Becker's is his view is that this labeling of individuals is really about social power, and it really focuses in on how those in power are using their resources to maintain their power. So they really see things like defining crime as a way to keep lower income, lower strata in individuals in that place, and to use laws and rules to benefit themselves, which is why oftentimes we can see very dangerous behavior done by the upper class or people in high social standing, and we know it's causing great harm to the society, but we don't even consider it a crime. And that's what's really, really hard. And so we're going to be looking at how these ideas are advanced, and these, how this labeling is advanced through things like the media, and how this is often used to secure the interest of the maintaining or the existing upper class. So to create some clarity here, this is coming from a conflict perspective, and the conflict perspective really sees two groups in society in a constant struggle over power and resources. And again, Quinney would see this as the dominant class continually trying to dominate and usurp as many resources for themselves using coercive means. So within this theory of social power by Quinney, we'll be looking at his 5 propositions or 5 dimensions of this theory that are really important. For one, the definitions of what's considered deviant are defined by those in power. And he really saw this as like a purposeful thing. This wasn't random. This wasn't implicit bias. That they did this intentionally to serve their own interests and advance their own interests, and to criminalize anything that might be a threat to those interests. And what we find is that there are agents of law enforcement, such as police and legislators, prosecutors, judges, who are administering this law. So again, it's not about the quality of the act, like how bad this act really is. It's about whether this is a threat to the people who have all the power. And so what we'll find is that definitions are oftentimes enforced very differently. So here I have a video for you about Congress's role in the opioid epidemic. And what many students find really surprising is that most of us by now have heard of the opioid epidemic. We're losing people every single day. Now we have things like fentanyl, and it's really kind of become a really huge thing in the United States. But many people don't understand that, members of Congress were actually getting paid out by Big Pharma. And in fact, one of these individuals was asked to be the drug czar, the head of, the connector in terms of the pharmaceutical industry to government. So he was actually rewarded for this type of behavior. But again, I want you to think about, you've heard all about the opioid epidemic, and you've heard about, what the media will describe as, these low lives, and I have my quotes up, right? Druggies, I don't like these words, but this is what they are called. And all the blame is put on them, and we don't necessarily see any blame being put on the people in power who are allowing for this stuff to happen or are being rewarded in their own ways. We'll see that the low-level offender will be criminalized. He'll be put into prison, But these people were actually rewarded for their behavior. And so we look at how, again, these definitions are enforced very differently depending on who it is, right? These members of Congress got, I think one of them got $150,000. That's much more than any low level of on one hit, that's much more than any low level offender is probably going to make even in a year. And so, and he was getting paid out directly by Big Pharma. So it gets you really thinking. And I have a lot of examples of this for you because these are the stuff that we're not hearing about. And in fact, I even had to really dig for this news, um, this media segment. Not that it was on mainstream media, but it's not something that we're hearing about all the time. So continuing on with this idea of the official definition of crime and, how the powerful use, their resources to create this idea that things are fair and, things are just, when in actuality it's their interests that are often being served first. Here in this slide, I have about three examples that speak to this idea when we look at the actual behavior of some of these individuals and how they were criminalized. And we can definitely see the connection to, again, the capitalist class. In sociology, we call them the bourgeoisie or the owners of production. So in the first case, we have a school superintendent who was actually charged with insurance fraud for using I think it was her son's insurance information to get health care for a student of hers. Now, insurance fraud is wrong, but we can definitely understand intrinsically the reason why she was engaging in this behavior. And when I kind of, give you some perspective, consider that it's healthcare companies or insurance companies who are oftentimes denying benefits to people who are paying for this, insurance as a way to save money. And that's been something that's been going on since, we saw this really institutionalized, is that this is our medical system is a for-profit system where we see, that power being used to manipulate, to gouge people. So, and there's another video about price gouging within pharmaceuticals, charging people an exorbitant amount for medicines that we know don't cost that much just because they know people are desperate, right? There's also an example here of a Florida man who was arrested for feeding the homeless. And most of you probably will find that really surprising, but there's quite a few states where this is actually illegal. And I want you to remember like the reasons why this is a threat to capitalism and, the people who are making the most are profiting the most. If you are giving out healthcare for free or giving out food for free, that means there's someone who is not paying for it, and then there is someone who is not profiting from it. And so understanding that, these institutions who are made of people are trying to, hold on as long as they can. Obviously, they don't want socialized healthcare. This is not good for business, so they're going to do everything they can to politically to keep that from happening, right? Because that doesn't serve their interests. And so, Coiney said that this isn't random. This is purposeful. And I think in these examples here, it's pretty easy to see that this is done on purpose. These people are, they recognize that this is wrong, especially in that last one. So go ahead and watch those, and then we'll keep talking about it. So again, the next definition of Coiney's social power theory looks at how these definitions are formulated, and I mean definitions of the law. And so he essentially said that definitions of law and crime are composed of behaviors that conflict with interests of the dominant class, as they have the power to translate their interests into public policy. So we see that this enforcement and administration are politically and directed against the powerless. It's the people who don't have the power to make these decisions, as seen in the examples on the previous slide. But we also see that there's a much bigger political stronghold going on, as again procedural rules are created to enforce these laws, right? Again, the more powerful segments of society can incorporate their interests, their values, their norms into the law. And the video that I have for you is talks about an organization called ALEC and how they represent the interests of the ruling class. And you'll see, it's not they've slipped right into government. They're right there. This is a big thing. They are absolutely influencing our politicians, and it's not a secret, and the politicians know it too. And so when we think of living in a democracy where everyone's vote matters, we will come to go, well, I don't know. I mean, if you have more money, I think you can do a lot more influencing than someone who doesn't. And so these are all something to think about as we kind of break down this theory and look at it. So the next dimension that we'll be looking at will be applying these definitions of crime. And Quinney said that definitions of crime can be applied by the class that has the power to shape enforcement and the administration of laws. That those with the interests, or those whose interests conflict with the ones represented in the law must either change their behavior or possibly be defined as criminal, right? And that criminal law is applied by legal agents, not by the dominant class itself. And so, what we'll find is that as the interests of the powerful become threatened, you will see law enforcement efforts ramped up and judicial activity ramped up. We saw this with the BLM protests this past summer, in that, as things became threatening, we saw more law enforcement kind of there. And again, oftentimes serving the interests of the powerful. So, as we talked about before, in looking at how this is all structured, this simply means that those in the lower class or those without any power will constantly have to adapt their behavior to kind of fit into this social structure, whether it's fair or not. Most of us would probably say it's not fair. Conflict approach would definitely say it's not fair. And so, for instance, you might have someone who is content living in a tent, but they know that they can't because of the way the definitions of crime have been, that this is actually against the law. But I mean, there's nothing inherently awful about living in a tent. It maybe just looks bad to the upper class, right? Like, oh, I live in Seattle, I don't want all these tents everywhere, it looks awful. And or whatever it is. And so they have to like adapt their behavior. So no, you're not going to live in a tent. Maybe you're going to couch surf or do something else that is deemed more kind of appropriate within society. And so it's really, really important. So people will constantly adapt their behavior. And again, this isn't about the actual behavior, it's about people's reactions to it. And what we'll find is that the more legal agents come to say, hey, your behavior is deviant or criminal, the more likely or the greater probability those criminal definitions will be applied and also internalized, right, by that individual. So, some of the overarching ideas that I want you to think about is, with all of this stuff going on, as people come to either internalize these ideas and then kind of amplify it, right? Like, yes, you become what these people tell you you are. What this is all doing, it's constructing an ideology of what crime actually is. Think about it. We talked about living in a tent. There's nothing awful about living in a tent, or even being homeless. um, Nothing bad about it, right? Think about the way immigrants have been criminalized, or even like media giving out ideas that crime is extremely pervasive when it hasn't been. So these ideologies of crime are constructed and diffused by the dominant class, and it influences our perceptions as we come to watch this. We saw President Trump call immigrants rapists and murderers. I mean, people believe that, right? And then again, it changes the whole story about the story was that immigrants were coming here because they don't have the economic resources to sustain in their own country, or there's massive amounts of violence, or whatever it is. But now you've changed the whole story, and now they're actually criminals themselves. And so it's changed the whole ideology about what crime actually is. And what's also interesting is people come to behave in reference to the social meanings they attach to their own experiences. So again, people will come to internalize these experiences that they've had. And in some ways, like we said, it can lead to, not for everyone, but it can lead to deviance amplification. Um, and I think also giving that idea that it's a fair and just system is also really troubling. That you get a trial by your peers. Well, not usually if you're Black, right? I mean, there have been so many cases where Black individuals, were tried by a jury of white people who are not their peers. They have not had the same life experiences. And so, ideas and images come to develop about, what crime is, who offenders are, what their characteristics are, as well as what are the appropriate reactions to these crimes as it relates to the social order. So here we kind of have a pictorial representation of how these dimensions of Quinney's theory, help us understand how crime is really very much socially constructed. It's only this way because we say it is, right? Again, there's nothing awful about sleeping in a tent. There's nothing awful about, having a beer. It's generally, done by those in power and kind of shaping this reality for everyone. And so, what's important for you to realize is that the more the power segments are concerned about a particular crime or behavior, kind of like how we saw undocumented immigrants being looked at more scrutinized in the last couple years. Those definitions will become solidified and created, and they become very real, right? I mean, people were ready to build a wall. And it really gets you thinking about this social constructionist idea, because, if you're looking at it from a one dimensional framework, building a wall might work. Right, but it's not being looked at it from a multi-dimensional framework. It's being looked at from this one narrative of these rapists and murderers are trying to get into our country, when there's so many people that actually are undocumented here already, and when you build a wall, you keep them from going home, or they come over here by plane, or just actually most immigrants overstay their visas. So it doesn't fit with these narratives, but these narratives have been so influential in shaping our criminal justice system, in shaping the way we look at what are most were known as social issues, but are now looked at as criminal issues. Other countries don't actually look at it this way, and that's it creates that understanding that this is all constructed by the powerful to maintain their power. So with that, I hope you had a wonderful week. Please reach out to me if you need any clarification or need any help with anything. I'd be happy to do that for you. And yeah,